All right, ladies and gentlemen, in this video I am going to be talking to you about what is necessary, how to write a formal lab report. What are the different sections and what needs to be in each of these sections? This way you can refer back to this video throughout the year. Quick comment before we get started. You're going to be writing about 2 of these per quarter. And remember, I do grade these on a sliding scale, essentially, where I assume that you have not written one before and I want to teach you how to write one. So know that for the first half of the year, your grade is going to be helped out when you're writing these formal lab reports. But in the second half of the year, by then I'm hoping that you would have learned what I'm looking for and you won't get any bump in the grade. So the first thing to talk about with these formal lab reports is that there need to be 5 distinct labeled sections. So I should see, when I look at the front page of your lab report, your name, the title of the lab, and then underneath that, introduction, actually labeled. So I don't want this in one big long paragraph format. It needs to have distinct sections. So there's the introduction section, there's the materials and methods sections, and we do want to use that phrase. There's the results section, there's the analysis section, and then there's the conclusion section. 5 distinct sections, each one is labeled. These different sections serve different purposes in the lab report, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So first up is the introduction. What does it do? What is the point of the introduction? The point of the introduction is to give all necessary background information to whoever happens to be reading your lab report, to make sure that they understand the language that you're going to be using. So key definitions. If we're doing a lab that has to do with molar mass, then you would need to define what molar mass is in the introduction. That way, when the reader gets to the section where you're talking about calculating molar mass, they know what it is that you're calculating. So all necessary background information. That is the point of the introduction. How do you structure the introduction? Basically, what needs to go into it with a little more detail than just background info? Well, first off, you want to start with the purpose of the lab. You always want to start with this purpose statement. In this lab, we will be doing fill in the blank. Then, after you've introduced the purpose of the lab, that's when you want to cogently and coherently go through the background information. So you want to think about what order you're giving this information in, that you're not just listing it off like a series of definitions. That's not what it is. This is paragraph format. You are having a dialogue with the reader. So you really need to think about what order you think you should introduce the material. At the end of the introduction, once you have gone through and talked about all necessary background information, now you want to start relating that background information to what you'll be doing in that lab. So you'll say, well, today we're going to be determining gram formula mass, and in order to do that, we will be taking the following measurements that will allow us to then calculate the gram formula mass. So you're relating the background information to your task at hand. What tense to use? Tenses change throughout the lab report. The introduction will always have a future tense, meaning you have not yet done the lab. You are preparing the reader to do the lab. So the lab is going to take place in the future. So notice all the stuff that I was talking about with the introduction. We will be finding gram formula mass. We will be taking the following measurements. You're using future tense. The next section is the materials and methods section. This is essentially your procedure, but it's not just your procedure from what you wrote in the lab note, but this is essentially the part of the lab report where you're saying what you did. So what does it do? What is the point of the materials and methods? It gives your reader enough information so that they can repeat the lab. That's the idea. If they wanted to verify your results, they can look at your materials and methods section, follow your instructions, and they can repeat what you did and hopefully get the exact same results. Because after all, in science, things have to be repeatable. How do you structure the materials and methods section? First of all, I want you to use paragraph format. I do not want a series of numbered steps here. Real scientists writing real journal articles do not use numbered steps in the materials and methods section. You are real scientists in this class. You are going to write like real scientists. I want you to have enough information so that the lab can be repeated precisely, meaning you might have gotten in the original handout mass out between 10 and 20 grams of something, but on the day of the lab you had a very specific number that you ended up massing out. I should see that specific number and not that between 10 and 20 grams. So it has to be exactly what you did on the day of the lab. If there are any changes from when you originally thought of your procedure for the pre-lab notebook, they have to be reflected here. So it really needs to be, what did you do on the day of the lab? What tense to use? You're using present tense and you're using objective language. You're using objective phrases, meaning weigh evaporating dish, obtain beaker, place on hot plate. You know you've written a good materials and methods section if you notice that a lot of your sentences start with verbs and tend to be commands, because you're telling the person what to do. So this is present tense. This is where you're actually doing the lab. Next up in the lab report is the results section. And I do actually need to talk about this section, a little bit more, because students are sometimes, oddly enough, confused about what goes in this section. This is the part of your lab report where you have all your numbers and all your calculated results. Not where you explain what your results mean or how you calculated those numbers. So what does the results section do? Basically, if there's a person reading your lab report and they just kind of want to see just what numbers you got, this would be the section that they turn to. So they're not interested necessarily in what the results mean, just what numbers did you get. So it'll, for the first lab report of the year, it'll have things like, percent composition of NaCl, and you'll have your number, and percent composition SiO2, and you'll have your number. So it's really just your calculated results. No work needs to be shown here. I do not want to see the explanations of how you got those results here. That is not what this section is. This section is really just what are your data. It should also include your data table from the lab. So it needs to have both things. Data table, so what numbers did you write down on the day of the lab, and then results, what did you do with those numbers? What information did you glean from that collected data? I do not want to see work. I'm going to say that again because it really bears repeating. This is not where you show me how you calculated your results. That's in the next section. It really is just numbers. It's like you're pooping your numbers on the page and then just leaving them there for everyone to goggle at. You're not explaining anything. What tense to use? Well, probably you're not going to be doing a lot of writing in this section. You could, for most labs, you could even have your entire results section in just a chart. Just insert a chart and have labels for each of the things. But if you are doing any writing, then you would want to use past tense, because at this point you have completed the lab and now you're reporting on it. The next section is the analysis section, and this is a really big one. So what does the analysis section do? What is the point of the analysis section? First of all, it interprets all of the data from the lab. So here's that interpretation part that the results section isn't. Then it explains all of your calculations. All of our calculations are explained. You analyze your results for possible sources of error. You compare your results to other scientists, other students in the class, and you comment on how your results compare to their results. You think about what could be done in the future to make this lab more effective. And yeah, if that sounds like a lot, it is. This is easily the longest section of your lab report. And if it isn't the longest section of your lab report, then you're not writing lab reports correctly. And notice I'm not saying my lab reports. I modeled this format for writing lab reports based on how actual scientific journal articles are presented. So you are writing in a format that in science is widely accepted with these different sections. What tense are you going to use in this section? You're going to use the past tense. You have finished your lab. You are commenting on it now. So with the lab report, you are almost moving through the lab process. In the introduction, you're going to do the lab. In the materials and methods section, you are doing the lab. And then in results and analysis, you have done the lab and you're looking at your data and what happened. So we're going to go step by step through the analysis. First of all, you do want to use paragraph format in your analysis section. It needs to open with an explanation of your results, how you arrived at your results, how did you calculate your results. So this is where you're going to put your calculations. There are two things that I'm always going to be yelling at you about your calculations, and not just in AP chemistry in general, and then specifically for the lab reports. Number one, I want to see all work. So I want to see numerical setups, I want to see units, I want to see original formulas. What formula are you basing this off of? And two, after you've shown me the calculations, you need to explain the calculations. Why are you doing what you're doing? How did you know to put that number there? Even if it's just explaining, well, we know that mass goes on top and moles go on the bottom, so therefore I put the mass, well, you're not going to use I, but we put the mass, which was 12 grams, over the moles, which was 0.5, and calculated the result to be 24. If there is any graph or chart that we need for the lab, you would also want to talk about it at the beginning of your analysis section, maybe after your calculations or before your calculations. It'll depend on what the graph or chart was used for. And when you include a graph or chart in your lab report and you're explaining it, there are always two things to bear in mind. You have to explain, first of all, how you made the graph, meaning how did you obtain the data that went into this graph? What went on the x-axis, what went on the y-axis, and why? And then, once you've explained how you made the graph, how did you interpret the graph? What information did you pull from it, and why? Why are you looking at that specific point on the graph? What is so special about that specific point on the graph? Why are you looking there? So you're explaining not only how you made the graph, but how you interpreted the graph. Both of those things have to be there. Continuing on, after you've talked about your calculations and your results and any graphs or charts you might have made, now you're going to move on to talking about sources of error. And every time we write a lab report, we've got to have at least 2 sources of error. Now, big comment about these sources of error. You are not simply listing 2 possible sources of error. You have to really think about how the source of error impacted your calculated results. Meaning, if you have to sort of carry the source of error through your calculations. If you spilled your solution that contained salt water, that would be a source of error. But you can't just say we spilled the solution, that's a source of error. You would have to say that means that we lost some of the mass of the salt. You are not done though, because your calculated result was percent composition. That was where you were going. So you then have to apply that loss of mass to not just the result for percent composition of the salt, but how would that impact any other percent compositions? Would it? And explain why in terms of the formulas and the calculations. I give another example here about like PV equals nRT. If you're claiming that a source of error was that your temperature was too high, you can't just say that that was a source of error. In PV equals nRT, having a temperature too high would have what impact on a calculated mole result? Think about what having a too large number for T would do to a calculated value for N. Then, how would that impact gram formula mass if you were using that mole number to calculate gram formula mass? So you really are thinking about how that source of error had an impact on your calculated result. To give you an idea for what level of explanation I'm looking for here, sources of error, when you talk about it, it should either be one very long paragraph or 2 normal paragraphs, meaning if you just write 2 sentences saying our source of error was this, a second source of error was this, you're not doing what you need to do. You need to thoroughly explain how that error impacted the experiment. Every single step, follow it through. Continuing on with analysis. After we talk about sources of error, now you're going to compare your results to others. So yes, you have to go and talk to other people in AP Chemistry and find out what they got and compare it to yours. Because guess what? I bet you didn't get the same result, but you all did the same lab. So talk to them about what they did, talk to them about their results, and share that information here. I want to see names of other students, I want to see the results of other students, and then I want to see you commenting on any differences between your results and their results. That's what I mean when I say compare to others, because that's what scientists do. Scientists don't work in a bubble. They talk to other scientists who are working on the same thing, and they compare to one another. You need to reference those other students, though, with respect. So you're going to use their last names in the lab report. You're not going to use their first names. Always just last names. Why do you think their results are different than yours? Comment on it. And then finally in the analysis, you want to talk about future improvements. If you were to do this lab again, what would you do differently and why? That's a big thing. Why would you do that differently? If you were to give advice to future AP Chemistry students about doing this lab, what would you tell them? What are your recommendations on repeating this lab? Reflect on the lab. What could be done to improve the experiment? That's the analysis section. It is easily the longest section of the lab report, and that will take you 100% the most time. I guarantee it. And then lastly is the conclusion. Ironically, we just finished the longest section of the lab report, and now we're going to have the shortest section of your lab report. The conclusion is as brief and to the point as possible. The conclusion is not a time for explanation. The conclusion is simply a time for summing everything up. That is the point of the conclusion. You simply, straightforward and to the point, say what you did and your major results, and really that's about it. That is it. You do not go into any level of explanation here. Essentially, the idea is, notice you are going to be repeating yourself throughout the lab. In the introduction, you're saying what it is you're going to be doing. In the materials and methods section, you're describing what you did. In the results section, in the analysis section, you're explaining what you did and why it worked out the way it was, and then the conclusion, you're saying it again. Yes, you are going to be repeating yourself over and over again. The point is that scientists tend not to pay attention to things, so we have to have things shouted at us several times. So we're hoping that by the time the reader gets to the conclusion, they've actually figured out, oh, they separated a mixture and found percent composition. That was unclear up until this point in time. How do we structure your conclusion? You really only need 3 things in your conclusion. You want to open with a statement about what you did in the lab. 1 or 2 sentences max. This is not a procedure. It is just a what did we do in this lab. Then you want to state your major results. So the big results, not like, what was the difference in mass between the beaker with the stuff in it and the beaker on its own. No. Major results. So percent composition. Then after you've stated your major results, then you want to talk about sources of error. Not explain them though, just restate them. Just say what they were. So this is your 2 sentences on sources of error. This is very, very, very short section. Like I said, you could do 3 sentences, and as long as you hit those 3 points, what you did, what you got, and what went wrong, that's basically it. You're done with your conclusion. What tense are you using? You're using past tense. You have finished doing the lab, and you are summing everything up. So you're using the past tense in this section. And one final comment. This is a formal document. This is a very formal document. Use formal language. I don't like to see contractions. Don't like to see contractions. Don't like to see abbreviations. Those are all informalities, and this is a very, very formal document. So to that end, you always want to use last names rather than first names. When you're talking about other scientists, use their last names. Other students, use their last names. Don't use first names. And along the same lines, no plural pronouns. No, you only want to use plural pronouns. You do not want to use personal pronouns. Do not use I, do not use me, do not use mine, do not use you. You want to always use we, you want to use our, you want to use they. I take off points every single time I see something in your lab report that says, I then determined the gram formula mass to be. No. Use we all the time. Scientists do not work in isolation. So even if there's just, on the rare occasion that there's just one author on a scientific research paper, which is very rare in this day and age, usually there's a minimum of 5 scientists attached to a scientific journal article. Even if it's just one scientist, they will still be using we in their writing. So you do not use I, me, or my. Search your document before you turn it in. It is so easy to do. Just search it for I, me, my, you, mine, stuff like that. And lastly, do not wait until the last minute to start. This is a multiple page assignment. This is a big assignment. This is not something that you can do the night before. And if you do it the night before, you're doing a very, very poor job. I don't have a minimum length. So I'm not telling you that each lab report has to be a certain length, because it will vary from lab report to lab report. It depends on what we did in the experiment. Some labs require different types of explanations. Some labs have data that takes up a large amount of space. So I don't tell you there has to be a minimum amount. But if your lab report is 2 pages long, I am lining up my red pens because I know based on what I'm looking for that there's no way you can give me everything I'm looking for in 2 pages. I'd say if you want to shoot for a pretty decent lab report to know what level of explanation you need, I'd say you want to shoot for more like 3 to 4. And The really great ones, they're more like 5+, just to give you an idea. But it varies from lab to lab. It really, really does vary from lab to lab and student to student. So that's what I have to say about lab reports. Refer to this throughout the year, and whenever I ask you to write a formal lab report, this is the type of document I'm talking about, and I'm going to give you an example of this in class. I basically wrote a fake lab report that shows you the level of detail I'm looking for in these sections.